let's talk about why it can be so challenging to buy or sell a property here on Long Island. And I'm also going to take you through the unique things about this market that you should know as either a buyer or a seller looking to buy or sell a property here on the island. All right, guys, my name is Anthony Vito with Real Broker here on Long Island. And let's start off with the big kicker for anybody that is buying or selling a property here for the first time or just hasn't done it in a while that they should know off the bat. So the first thing that's really important to know here is that when you have an offer accepted, it really doesn't mean anything. Okay, so let's talk about why that is. First thing is, we don't do purchase and sale agreements here as buyer's agents, okay, or as seller's agents, either way you want to look at it, okay? Instead, we do a proposed offering or an offer and term sheet. So really all that is, it's a proposed offer and term sheet that the buyer's agent is going to submit to the seller's agent to review with his client. If the seller says, okay, great, I accept these terms of sale for my home, it doesn't really mean anything because no deposit was made with that offer and no money can yet be held in escrow, okay? That's because it's not an actually binding agreement like you might have in other stages of the purchase and sale contract. So biggest thing to know from the buyer side is once that offer is accepted, you need to move as quickly as possible to actually get that home under contract to make sure that that ticker says pending. So when an offer is made, there's not going to be any deposit from the buyer's side that the seller holds or escrow holds or anything like that. Offer is accepted, seller says I agree to the terms that you're presented. You know, it's going to be basic stuff: price, terms of closing, deposit on contract, and any other contingencies that are involved in the deal. The most common obviously are your mortgage contingency, your financing contingency, and the ability to basically purchase the property with clear title. So offer is proposed to the seller, seller accepts it. Now what? Well, buyer's usually going to do a home inspection, which is typical. So a buyer does a home inspection. Now at that point, after that is when you're actually going to be working toward a contract of sale. So let's talk about what the contract of sale is and unique things to know about that when it comes to buying a house here on Long Island. So let's talk about attorneys, okay? And when you want to buy or sell a property here on Long Island, yes, you will need to hire an attorney to do your contract and your closing. So what does that mean? Well, now we're at the stage where your offer's been accepted or you've accepted an offer from the buyer, and now you're going to get an attorney involved to send out the actual contract of sale to make the offer real and actually bind the parties together. So seller's attorney is going to draft the contract based upon the proposed offering terms that were submitted to the seller's side, okay, that the seller accepted at this point. They're also going to include a bunch of other terms and portions of that contract that were not on the offering and terms. A lot of this stuff is boilerplate and there is a standard New York contract, but every attorney is going to do this process a little bit differently. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. And it's really important to know that you're using a real estate attorney and not somebody who does a little bit of real estate and a bunch of other things in the law, because this process is very unique here. You definitely want to have an attorney who specializes in residential Long Island real estate. The seller's attorney now drafts that contract, sends it to the buyer's attorney to review. Typically, they're going to go back and forth on some of that boilerplate language and any other riders involved in the contract and make sure that the terms and the language all lines up to be fair for each side, and also is what was presented on the first time with the offer and term sheet, and none of those major things are changed. We've seen it all in this industry, and any big changes like that are unsettling, obviously, to the buyer or seller side when they review them. Now that the buyer's attorney has had an opportunity to review the contract, they agree that the terms in the contract will satisfy the buyer's needs and also are fair, the buyer will then sign the contract. At this point, this is the first time in part of the deal that the buyer is actually going to put any money down to be held in escrow to actually hold this property under contract and allow them to continue the process of purchase. When it comes to actually signing that contract, this is going to be the time they're actually going to put down your earnest money deposit. And here in Long Island, you're not going to be giving them $1,000 to $5,000 when it comes to putting that deposit down. You're going to be doing a minimum of 5% of the purchase price. Especially when we get above that $1 million price point, for example, it's usually going to be a minimum of 10 to 15%. So these checks can become pretty large, okay? Of course, if something goes wrong in the deal, as long as it's a valid contingency in the contract, you'll get that money back. But you might be locking that money up under that contract for as long as 90 to 120 days. So it's really something to be aware of. Make sure that once you start this process, your down payment funds for your contract are accessible. Make sure if they're in a CD, you're making sure you can get that money out, mutual funds, whatever it is, you're actually having that money in a proper account so you can write a check that day. Personal check is fine. Some sellers' attorneys want a certified check. but when it comes to deposit on contract, usually a personal check is fine. It's just good to understand here that it's going to be a large portion of money. It's not going to be a small deposit. Another major challenge when it comes to buying property here in Long Island is that we have some of the highest closing costs out of anywhere when actually buying a property. So in addition to coming up with those monies for down payment, you're also going to have a large sum of money for closing costs. Most of my clients are paying between $20,000 in closing costs. I've seen up to as high as $75,000. And a lot of that has to do with the taxes. It's really important to make sure that when you're getting a pre-approval from that lender and you're looking at a specific property that you're going to buy, you ask your preferred lender for a estimated closing cost sheet so you can get a good handle on how much money you're actually gonna have to put down total when it comes to buying that property here in Long Island. We also have some additional fees not everybody knows about. Here in New York, we have the New York State Mansion Tax. Any property that is being purchased for $1 million or more, the buyer is responsible to pay a 1% fee to New York State. So if the purchase price of the property is $1,500,000, the buyer would have to pay an additional $15,000 to New York State in closing costs at the closing table. Let's talk about what closing time looks like here on Long Island and what to expect from both the buyer and seller side. So the first thing is going to be, we have a clause in the contract that states that the closing will be on or about a 30-day time period. Well, let's say you go under contract on September 15th, for example. Typically the closing will be set for November 15th, but it's on or about 30 days. So what does that mean? Other states are going to actually have a closing date that everyone's going to work toward, including title, the mortgage banker, the inspector, appraiser. Everybody involved in the process understands what that date is and works toward that date. Well, here we're working toward a general area that works for both the buyer and the seller to actually close on the property. Now, if this isn't navigated correctly from the buyer's agent side or the seller's agent side, this can become very stressful, because if you don't actually have a set closing date, how do you know when to pick your movers? How do you know when to actually have a time that you're gonna move out of the property, have the property cleaned, have any additional maintenance done? When are you stopping the landscapers, the utilities? There's a lot of moving parts in the transaction. So having a good buyer's agent and a good seller's agent to actually communicate this and keep all parties informed is really important. With this on or about 30 days, what it really means is that once the contingencies are filled, let's say the two main contingencies in every contract will be financing and clear title. Once that happens, we can talk about actually setting a closing date somewhere around that date. So in your deal, if you have a certain time that needs to be set, make sure that's communicated up front by your broker. Same thing from the seller's side, that they're communicating that with the buyer's side. This way everybody can have a clear idea of saying, okay, although the contract states November 15th here, for example, we're really not planning to close until 12/10, and this is why. And this way everybody understands that there's no last minute push-offs or confusion, and people don't have to cancel movers, and they can actually prep to make sure they're working toward that date. But remember, you have to get the bank at the table that day. You have to get the title agency there to help close out their side. You need to get the agents involved there, and you also obviously have to get the buyer's and seller's attorney to actually be available on that date and that time for all the parties to be together. And of course, you need the buyer and seller as well. So when it comes to actually fulfilling the financing contingency for the buyer, it's also very important that that bank understands the process here and doesn't make any false assumptions about what to expect from here. So as somebody who's been doing this for almost 10 years now here on the island, I really prefer that the buyer uses a local bank to the area, and 9 out of 10 times their process is going to be a lot better if they're using somebody who often does financing in this area, just because it's such a different market. As a seller's broker, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to whoever issued that pre-approval to the buyer, the pre-qualification, and we're going to vet the buyer. We're going to make sure that it was a good conversation that was had with them. The buyer knows what to expect monthly payment-wise from this. They have the proper taxes, insurance in on the deal when they issued the pre-approval for this property, and then obviously the buyer's finances as well, right? I want to make sure that income was actually checked through tax returns, pay stubs, W-2s, etc., and their credit was actually ran, right? It wasn't just a quick conversation or a soft credit pull. I want to make sure that the lender has all the information that they need to actually issue that pre-approval, because we know that not all of them are made the same. But I also want to take that time to make sure that the bank knows timeline here and what to expect. Oftentimes, they don't realize that we might be closing here in more of a 60 to 90 day time frame, which is way longer than other markets. And if so, they're not going to want to lock that buyer's rate so soon. And they also need to understand how they're going to prep their underwriting department. So as far as timeline goes, it's super important to have that communication going with the bank as well. It's also important to make sure that they're properly speaking with the attorney and they understand this information might not come through me. They need to be in touch with the buyer's attorney on the deal, who's actually going to be setting the closing and facilitating the transaction to the end. So as the broker, no matter I'm on the buyer side or the seller side, I'm making sure everybody's communicating. We're all on one email chain and there's not a bunch of different forms of communication going back and forth, because the whole point of this is that everybody involved in the deal understands the local Long Island market. They understand that it's things that are specific to our deal. And like I said, if I can make a recommendation, it's always to use somebody local. And if not using somebody local, make sure that your buyer's broker or your seller's broker had a conversation with that bank, introduced themselves, and did coach them through a little bit on what to expect here in this market. Another big challenge when you're searching for property here on Long Island as a buyer is that not everything you're going to see online, whether it's on Zillow, Homes.com, Realtor.com, Redfin, wherever you choose to look, is actually going to be available, even though it shows as available. That property could very well have an accepted offer on it, have a home inspection completed, or even have a half-signed contract from the buyer and a deposit. So make sure that you have a good trusted professional who's actually getting you the inside scoop on some of these listings, so you know what homes are actually available for you to see and purchase. So oftentimes here, when we are listing a property for sale or showing the property from the buyer's side, there is going to be someone living at the property. So what do I mean by that? Well, in other states, you might have oftentimes where the properties you're looking at are vacant already, right? And no one's living there, they've already moved out. So it's easy to show the property. It's easy to go at your own timeline. You can basically go anytime. There's a lockbox on the door. There's no pets inside. There's nothing else you need to be aware of. You can bring your family back multiple times, and it's a really easy showing process. Well, it's not to say that that's not the case here on Long Island, but oftentimes here, the property is actually occupied until the day of the closing. I would say probably 75% of the time, my sellers are still living in the property. So what does that mean? Well, as far as timeline goes and showing wise, you have to be a little more efficient with your showings. So it might not be a place you can bring your aunt and uncle back 15 different times or your contractor before actually making an offer on the property. You very well might have one opportunity to look at the property before making an offer. It's not to say that the seller doesn't want to show, it's just that actual convenience of showing the property just isn't as easy. So it's something to think about whether you're on the buyer side. And from the seller side, the other thing to talk about is you do want to make your property easily accessible and showable. This way the experience for the buyer is a good one and it's not one that is challenging or difficult to do. So one recommendation that I always make to my sellers is we could do designated time block for showings. So I might say this, if we're listing a property on a Monday or a Tuesday, we might do designated time block showings between 2 and 5 p.m. on Wednesday and Thursday, where I've already set with the sellers to be out of the property for those 3 hours. We might only end up having 2 showings through that time period, and it could be a little longer, but I'm giving easy times basically for the buyers to set up showings for the home, and they can plan in advance and come back as many times as they want. We might follow that up with a double open house or a 3-day open house, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, for another couple of times. But if your seller is still living in the property and you're representing them as an agent, it's always a good idea to have designated time block and showing set up so the process is simple for everybody, and buyers also can plan, know exactly what to expect when trying to get into that home. So a big change in the market that has to do with these things that make it a little bit challenging here on Long Island is that sellers now are obligated to issue a buyer a PCDS, a property condition disclosure statement, before the buyer signs the contract of sale. Usually the seller's attorney is going to include this when they send the contract to the buyer's side to review and actually execute the contract. So you'll have a good understanding of any alterations that were done to the property, any malfunctions or any mechanical issues that you need to be aware of, and the age of a lot of things on there. But there is still a kicker to it. Yes, this is required, but not when the property is in a trust. So a lot of our properties here on Long Island are in a trust. So if the property is in a trust, although the seller might be living there and they might be a living trust, they don't have to fill out a property condition statement. You also don't have to do one on condos. Now, when it comes to structural things for condos, obviously there's a little bit less to know than a single family home because the condo association might actually be responsible for some of those things. But if you're buying a condo or you're buying a property that's currently in a trust, do not expect to receive a PCDS when signing a contract. All right, guys, so that wraps up today's video about why it can be so challenging to actually buy or sell a property here on Long Island, and just a couple of things that you should know before actually getting involved in the process. So if you have any other further questions or are thinking about buying or selling and just want to dive deeper into any of the things we talked about today, feel free to hit me below in the description. You're going to have my Instagram, my Facebook, our website. You can shoot me a message on there anytime you want. No pressure at all. Happy to give you a little bit more insight on the process. I also have a very good network of trusted professionals, including attorneys, titles, lenders, inspectors, that you can also pick their brain on anytime to learn a little bit more about those steps in the process and how we actually buy and sell real estate here on Long Island. Again, my name is Anthony with Real Broker, and thank you again for tuning in.